So I feel like tonight I'm kind of winning the lottery because I get to pivot us to the sort of what do we do? What do we do with all of that information? How do we turn this sort of complex climate setting, one we've coped with and understand intimately from our lived experiences, and obviously one that the data show are changing? But how do we manage that? How do we think about these changes and put that in the context of our everyday lives and the decisions that we make and that some of you on this call are charged with making on behalf of your constituents and of course as residents, how to engage in these conversations. So my name is Heidi Roop and I am a new faculty member at the University of Minnesota, and I'm also serving as the state's new extension specialist for climate science and climate adaptation. So I'm going to share a little bit. I keep getting asked about like, what can cities do? And for me, it implies that cities and others aren't doing anything yet. And fortunately in Minnesota, there's a lot of thought and action going into preparing our communities for a changing climate for much of these impacts that Kenny's just described for us. There is, in fact, an organization that's been around for about a decade, convening leaders and thinking about sort of noodling and brainstorming on the sort of how do we turn this information into action, and that's the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership. It represents university, state, regional and local jurisdictions and private and public entities all working together to think about how we prepare for climate changes. So I'm going to focus primarily today on the preparation piece of climate rather than the mitigation piece. I'll talk a little bit about that, but just sort of context setting. Really going to talk about how it is we plan for some of these changes that we know we've set in motion as we've warmed the planet. The Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership is actually the only multi-sector statewide group working on this sort of preparation piece, and some of what I'm presenting today builds on that bench, but I am putting this here mostly to flag that there is a ton of effort, investment, energy, interest, and expertise on the ground in communities, in state agencies, really working on how to onboard information like Kenny just described, both our observed and projected changes, and turn that into managing and designing things differently, whether those things are roads and bridges or our parks or even sort of our cities in terms of our planning and sort of resiliency guidelines, which is something that will come at the end of this process that you all undertake together, really understanding these sort of sector-wide implications and opportunities and putting that together into a comprehensive plan for how it is you build resilience. So we just heard, and this is just repeating this, Minnesota is experiencing a range of climate impacts at different rates and scales. And I think the reason this is important is that there is unfortunately no one size fits all solution or action that can fit every need in Minnesota or every need of every state. And so there is certainly the need for work and support at scale, meaning national scales, international scales, state scales. But there's a critical component of local engagement and sort of city and county-based decision-making that's essential to managing these impacts. So just as Kenny described, some of how the climate change context shows up in your community is different from what happens in, say, far northeastern Minnesota. We have to think about localized solutions, certainly putting those in context with what's happening across the state and the broader region, but really thinking about what solutions and actions fit our community and our priorities and our needs and shape the vision for the future that we want as a community. And then, of course, you have to figure out how to leverage, say, resources and other things that are happening at different scales. But really thinking about this in a granular community or city-specific context is important. And how we experience these impacts is largely dependent on how well we understand them. So information like Kenny provided is essential for characterizing our risks. And then importantly, figuring out how it is we effectively manage these risks. Adaptation involves actions and investments that reduce our exposure to these increasing risks. So I'm going to be talking to you about some of the ingredients that go into successful adaptation. What are questions you can ask and ways you can approach this rather big problem or opportunity, and also set yourselves up for, again, unfortunately, just like there's no one size fits all solution, there's no real endpoint for adaptation, because it is going to be, hopefully, this idea of climate change or climate smart decision making will be sort of socialized and embedded into the processes and discussions that we have as community members, as cities, as jurisdictions, as counties. And so it's sort of, I'll show you kind of a cycle of what adaptation looks like, meaning there's really, there's a beginning, but there's no real end. And so this is, I think, something we think about as a system and a process moving forward. So how we feel climate change critically involves sort of two main pieces. One we hear about a lot, and that is certainly critical. I'm not going to touch on this conversation, but is one I'd be happy to have if there's interest. But that is how well we prevent further warming. That is how well we mitigate or reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases, the thing that is causing the planet to warm, the combustion of fossil fuels. So emissions reductions are essential for reaching our international policy targets, and also our state targets that have been set for working towards a carbon-free state. So I'm not going to touch on that here, but mitigation is essential, and we have to then balance that with how well we are prepared for the changes that we know we've set in motion. So we've committed to a certain amount of climate change, of climate impacts, things that are going to change on the landscape. We determine and we choose the extent to which those things change by way of our emissions reductions, but we have to start preparing and making those investments. There's research that looks at natural hazard mitigation costs. So this spans a wide range of things, not just natural disasters related to climate, but disasters that are amplified by climate, like hurricanes. But there's the National Institute of Building Sciences published a report that looks broadly at hazard mitigation efforts by government bodies. And they demonstrate that across a whole class of things, including floods, that investments in resilience have a return on investment, meaning you can save money by investing in sort of climate-informed decision making. So as we look to adapt, there are, in fact, financial incentives for making decisions today to shape tomorrow. So there are reasons why, and economic drivers behind why shifting from a stance from being reactive to these climate impacts, so just sort of managing as they surface and as we experience them, to one that's proactive. So trying to understand that, of course, there's going to be extremes, there will be curveballs. We don't have a crystal ball for the future, but there is a real opportunity to think about how we can shape our future today and ultimately save costs down the road by onboarding some of this information, or at least thinking about how it maps onto the decisions that we're making today that will impact our future resilience. When it comes to mitigation and adaptation, it's not an either or. I hear this a lot, like we have to mitigate and not adapt. And unfortunately, we're at a point now where we have to be considering both. It's imperative. Our success, and again, our exposure to these impacts really is largely dependent on both how much we reduce our emissions and now how well we prepare for those changes that we know are coming. So how bad they get is sort of determined by the emissions piece, but we know the changes are here and they're going to worsen as we march forward in time. And that, of course, these changes are going to occur within our lifetime. So that they're happening now, and this idea that climate change is a far off future phenomenon is just not the case. 2030, not very far away, mid-century, we're so used to hearing about these things and parking them in the future as sort of not my problem now. Unfortunately, that's no longer a choice we get to make. This is something that we will either directly experience or family members of ours, our children, this will be the world that they're living in the future. So I have colleagues, they said this very succinctly, more succinctly than I have, which is that we need to adapt to climate change even as we seek to mitigate it. Importantly, polling across the country shows that there's a desire for action at all levels of government. This is showing a 2019 poll result from AP and EPIC that suggests that around, let's just average this out, around 80% of adults in America want to see federal, state, or local government or community action related to climate change. So I think the conversation is shifting and people want to see leadership and are generally in support of action, so long as they can see how they show up and matter to them in their communities. And that's sort of what I'm going to hopefully provide you with a framework for thinking about this as you move forward together in these conversations. So of course, climate science and climate adaptation and this idea of climate smart decision making really requires thinking about how this information or thinking about a different future fits into an already complicated system of drivers and competing priorities, right? We are living in the midst of a pandemic. There are politics and economic drivers and community values all at play and all in flux as we think about how we design these systems. So these are sort of drivers that we are already more or less familiar with navigating, or types of uncertainty that we're more or less comfortable with incorporating into our risk management decision making. And it's really about sort of how does climate science slot into this puzzle? So we have to prepare. So that's the point. We've got to prepare. We need to make these investments. They tend to be smart investments. But we run into this conundrum, right? Which is that not only do we have to slot this into all these other competing priorities and economic drivers and lack of resources and all of these other things, but we also can't be prepared for everything. We can't take those extremes that Kenny just described and say, we're going to like build a bubble around the city and we're going to be prepared for any possible future. That's just not the reality. We can't always be prepared for the worst case. A great example of this is in coastal communities. It is really, really, really costly to prepare for the highest magnitude of sea level rise, like on the order of tens of feet, and when the probability of that is really low. It doesn't mean you can use that to ignore the fact that sea level will rise, but you can't plan for that high magnitude, low probability event unless, Jeff Bezos comes and gives you all his money, right? So there's some real limitations and realities that we have to think about when we talk about onboarding this climate information. And then of course, we can't afford to do nothing, right? We can't be unprepared. That's just sort of not an option. So what do we do? Fortunately, there are a lot of people across the globe that think about this and we've worked to set priorities and identify pathways for doing this. So I think most critically for this conversation, as you move forward, it's really important to think about, as you look at these sort of sector-specific impacts and opportunities, thinking about how it is that you define and identify your needs and your priorities, right? With that idea that you can't do everything, but you have to do something. How can we make decisions, set priorities, and adopt sort of an adaptive management, meaning you could make a decision today, but revisit that down the road to do the sort of gut check and the climate data check. Is what we planned for sort of surfacing on the landscape, or is it getting worse? Or is it maybe there's a different impact that's of greater concern? And so it's really about trying to think about how we can do and collaborate differently, right? And this is the fundamental problem and the challenge and the opportunity all bundled in one. So there's a broad literature on sort of what adaptation looks like, the cycle of adaptation, what kind of ingredients are required. One of those, of course, the first and fundamental ingredient is understanding your climate risks and vulnerabilities. So much of what Kenny just described. You've got to understand what your exposure to those risks are. So what sort of assets are exposed? What are the costs and consequences of those impacts to the things we care about or are responsible for managing? Think about how to integrate that knowledge into these sort of needs and priorities and existing frameworks that you already use. And then of course, the hard part, you have to implement those. So implement it in operations, change behaviors, make investment decisions, and act sort of with purpose, like using this information in a way that's purpose driven. And then of course, you need to engage community and understand and build institutional capacity for doing this work. And some of these are kind of interconnected, right? They're sort of all part of one big stew. And then, as I said, there's sort of, with a cycle, there's no real end. You sort of go around the cycle. You have to monitor and evaluate what's working, what's not working. How do we onboard new information, new priorities, other uncertainties unrelated to climate, like economic drivers or population changes, changes in values. How do we bring those things on board? And so it's really about changing systems and changing ways in which we sustain and build dialogue. Common barriers that you're probably going to experience as you think about this prioritization process include things like organizational barriers, communication barriers around sort of lack of support, or how is it that we communicate about uncertainty in climate projections, technical challenges. You may not have the data you need or that you would like to make a decision. Of course, there's resources and capacity, things like time and funding to do all of this work. But Chris has got it. He can do this all. And then, of course, policies. It's really hard to do things if you don't have the mandates or the regulations or the authority to sort of act in a climate smart way. And so this is sort of the complex stew of things that will probably surface as you have these discussions. But it's important to think about how we overcome these barriers. And the nice thing is that a lot of people interact with these barriers, and so you're not alone. And I don't know, my slides are no longer advancing, so I'm gonna we'll see, that just worked. So I've got a delay here on my end. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in the same way that it's provided a whole slew of advice around projected and observed climate changes globally, they've also brought research leaders together to think about where are key investment areas for supporting this type of work to enhance resilience. So I'm going to run out of time here. So here are some key ingredients that I'd like for you to think about as you move forward in this process. So how is it that you can improve coordination and collaboration, admitting that there's barriers and roadblocks that are going to emerge? How is it that you can basically better support this work through more effective communication, through coordination and collaboration? Who is present, who's not present in this process that could be, that's going to help enable success? How do we work across different boundaries, whether those are, political boundaries, geopolitical boundaries, geographic boundaries, so on and so forth. One thing that we're really working on as a state, and Kenny mentioned this, some of these data will be available to all Minnesotans soon through the state climatology office, is locally specific scientific information. So this is something that we're really, really working on at the university level and the state level to try to deliver this information so folks like yourself can use it, which is that locally specific climate information to help you characterize your risks and vulnerabilities and really understand the range of possible futures and what risks you can manage for, right? Again, you may not be able to plan for the high end, but how can you set some standards or some guidelines for what you'd like to be able to plan for? Considering nature-based adaptation approaches has been identified as a great kind of dual there's a co-benefit opportunity there, both for adaptation and mitigation. So thinking about ways in which nature and our landscape can be working in partnership with us as we work towards resilience. And then investments in education and capacity building. And I would say that this is this process you're going to be undertaking and the opportunity to engage in these conversations, sort of sector-specific conversations, is a great example. And actually, I think probably some national leadership is being demonstrated here. I think this is a really, really great case study for how communities can embark on this education and capacity building effort. Thinking about your future climate risks, how you prioritize, how you goal set, and how you move forward, right? How we get empowered by this information and not just sort of stopped in our tracks because of its complexity and the size of the challenge. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I think, so I've spent a lot of time thinking about this with colleagues of mine, and we've sort of boiled this down to sort of 4 buckets. So thinking about your work and what you're doing and sort of what are prerequisites or the building blocks for climate resilience, really thinking about what knowledge is needed, where can you find it, how do you use it? Of course, we need to have people motivated to act. So decision makers need to be interested and driven to act in a way that is climate smart, that onboards this information. We, of course, need capacity. Those are time and money resources, and skills to use and apply, like the information and tools that Kenny and I have both described. And then, of course, like authority is a really important one. We need to have policies and guidance and things set in place that help people make these decisions or understand how this information can be integrated in their different contexts or decision making, right? Whether you're if you're an engineer and you're designing some water infrastructure, making sure you have access to that information, but also that there are policies in place that incentivize or require you to use that information. So these are things that are being worked on at a variety of scales that might help you think about this. So my question to you, and I'll wrap up here, is sort of what do you need to advance adaptation? Sort of hearing all that you heard. Of course, you're not going to have an answer to this now, but I think as you look towards that end goal in the fall, coming together and convening, how are you going to tackle some of these challenges or get onto that cycle of adaptation and really onboard some of this critical climate information in order to shape the community that you want today for tomorrow? So I'll end there and thank you so much.